the kind of the actual sections of the content. We're starting in the years 1200 to 1450. And we are going to start our discussion in East Asia. Okay. Which obviously is going to revolve around China, but of course we're going to make our way as well to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Okay, so we last left off talking about the Song Dynasty, and that is where we're going to continue here, who are going to last from the 10th century, 10th through the 13th century, which kind of puts them in at the start of our section here, right? So they do a lot of stuff here. We've talked about a bit of this already. They will eventually fall to the Mongols. But one thing we do need to know about them is that they lose northern China pretty quickly to northern Manchurian nomads known as the Jin Empire. Okay. However, just because they have southern China doesn't mean that they're not important or powerful. They are very important. They do a lot of really important things. And so one of the key things that made the Song very successful, not just the Song, but for a lot of people, is the imperial bureaucracy. Okay, which the imperial bureaucracy, if you know anything about that. For those of you who don't know what a bureaucrat is, we've talked about a lot, but just in case you don't, they are appointed officials by the government, and they go throughout the country and help implement the policies of the empire, right, which have been around for almost 1,000 years at this point, right? And so the key thing that the Song do is that they expand the imperial bureaucracy pretty significantly, which allowed for a good chunk of social mobility because of the civil service exam, right, which allowed for anybody to compete in it. Okay, which allowed for anybody to compete for the possibility of doing of being in the bureaucracy, right? And the bureaucracy itself was a very highly desired job, right? It was very prestigious and brought a lot of honor to your family, to your community, right? And so we would call this a meritocracy, right? Which means that it was all about who could, whoever was the best was going to get the job. Okay. You do not see a lot of poor people in the system that are kind of be successful because the wealthier families do have benefits like being able to hire tutors and stuff. However, you do see some examples of this, right? The problem becomes that over time, what we see is that we see that the bureaucracy grows too big, right? The bureaucracy grows too big, which leads to rising costs, right? Which is going to lead to some major issues for the government later on, right? Which is going to kind of swallow up a lot of their tax revenues, right? All right, so let's talk about some economic developments of the era, right? We've talked about quite a few of these, right? The Grand Canal, as we've talked about before, Grand Canal was a very big deal. This allowed expanded trade pretty significantly, right? Within China, right? Not just without China, but within China in particular. We also see the development of champa rice. Let's go ahead and I should have probably. I'm gonna come back and do that. We see the development of champa rice, right, which allows for multiple crops per year, right, which is it's fast ripening and drought resistant, right, which greatly expands farming production, right, which help boom the economy, right. The more farming you have, the more people are healthy, right? The more population, you have being able to engage with the good and eat and be healthier, and then they'll have more kids, and so it'll lead to a large population, right? We also have not just champa rice for farming purposes, right? But we also have an increase. Excuse me. We have an increase in usage of certain innovations like fertilizers, right, and irrigation networks, right, to help make the soil better for farming, right? Um, so those are a big deal. On top of that, also the creation of heavy plows, right, which allowed to kind of bury deeper in the soil, right, which got you out of that topsoil. That topsoil is usually the least fertile, so if you can get lower, that is better, right? We also have things like water wheels, right, as well as water pumps, right, and also terraced farming, right. Water wheels and pumps are there to help. Water wheels are there to kind of do the same thing that mills do. Water pumps allows to get water from underground reservoirs or from the river, and then also terraced farming allows for much simpler or much more efficient use of water. Basically, you farm on the side of a hill, right? If you have a hill right here, right, what you end up kind of doing is cutting away chunks of it, so that then there are these kind of steps there, right, that allow you to just kind of let the water drip down, right? Okay. Let's see here. So this leads to massive population growth, right? These two things in particular. Massive population growth during this time period, to the point where almost 40% of all people on Earth live in China. So that's quite a lot. Getting back to this, so on top of this agricultural growth, right, we also see manufacturing growth, right? We see the discovery of coal in the 4th century, which leads to an increase in iron production, right? And then eventually the creation of steel, right? Which is a stronger version of iron, which allowed them to make kind of better infrastructure, which eventually, of course, will become like, the main product of the 19th and 20th centuries, right? And so on top of this also made agricultural products better, which are agricultural tools better, which made more farming, right? So that's a positive feedback loop there, right? A little bit. And so we see the first usage of this term here that we won't talk about again for quite a while, proto-industrialization. Okay. So what this book defines this as is pretty simply people producing more than they could sell, which then leads to kind of giving it to merchants and putting it on the open market, right? And what is happening here, this is community-based, this is home-based or community-based, home or community-based production, right? So it's not just like they don't have factories, right? This isn't factories or anything. What's happening is that we're seeing artisans in particular, right, just being able to produce so much material during this time period, right, especially in steel and iron, right, in these massive kind of workshops that just led to such a boom in these goods that there was just so much to go around. It makes things cheaper, right? And it's not just iron, right, although it is iron and steel goods, but also especially porcelain goods, which were very well regarded as a luxury because they were light, which means they were easy to transport, and then also they were white, which meant that they were easy to kind of manipulate artistically, right? And then on top of that, of course, we have kind of proto-industrialization of silk goods as well. Okay, their technologies that they were able to use to kind of get these to the world, right, is the compass, of course, paper used for maps, right, which allowed them to navigate a lot easier. Both of these allowed them to navigate without necessarily knowing exactly what they were trying to do. right? And so these really help lead to a growth in foreign trade, right? Whereas we've already seen things like the Grand Canal increase domestic trade, trade within the country, right? So this becomes, at this point, China is the biggest trade center in the world at this juncture, right? It's got all these goods people want. It's got a very wealthy society that's willing to purchase things. It's got a society that's willing to produce things. We have internal trade and external trade going on quite well, right? On top of this, we have a way that the Song really also promote even more economic growth and trade. So previously, public works projects, right? Which, if you don't know what public works projects are, those are, you know, government-backed projects that allowed for people that made people's lives easier, whether that's building roads, whether that's building walls and defenses, right? Whether that's building irrigation networks, right? Previously, public works were done by kind of conscripted labor, right? Or forced labor, right? The government would force people to come work, but now instead they would pay people to do it, which means more money in their pockets, right? More money to the people, which means an increase in the economy, right? Again, we're kind of seeing this idea right now in the United States, right? This kind of stimulus package where each family is going to get $1,200 with the idea that people spend it, which leads to a huge injection of money into the economy, right? And so that promotes a lot more economic growth as well. Okay, lastly is the tributary system. Let me actually go ahead and put this in. Lastly is the tributary system. We talked about this previously, but this occurs by the time of the Song Dynasty. It's in Japan, it is in Korea, and is in many parts of Southeast Asia, where these countries every year or every however long, right, they come to the Chinese emperor, right, and they give money in the form that's tribute to the Song, and then also perform the kowtow, right, which is kind of just a deferential way of bowing your head until it hits the floor as a sign of deference to the emperor, right? They also talked about Zheng He, who we're not going to go into too much detail on right now, right? But we will when we need to. Okay. Let's get our pyramid going today. It's been a while since I've done a pyramid. Okay. So we've got our we got our kind of social structure here of let's see, I think that should be good. Yeah. All right. So at the tippy top of Chinese social structure, of course, is the emperor and his family, right? They are, they got the mandate of heaven. They can do whatever they want. Next up is the typical aristocrats, right? Which have, a lot of land, right? They're landed wealthy, right? But we also have a new group kind of entered the fray, not necessarily during this time period, but they definitely make themselves much more powerful during this time period, and that is the scholar gentry, right? This is, it's one of two things. It's usually bureaucrats who gain land due to their wealth as bureaucrats, right? Or it could also be the children of aristocrats who were able to become bureaucrats, and so they were already pretty wealthy, right? And they will outnumber the aristocrats in this society, and they will eventually become much more powerful in this society than the aristocrats, right? Which is, super rare. They're the most influential social class within China at this point. Okay. Yeah, I do need another one. Okay. So next up is, well, let's actually kind of bundle these together. Next up is going to be farmers and artisans, right? Who produce for the good of the country, right? They do good things for society. They make food. They're not wealthy per se, but they are not at the bottom level, because that bottom level goes to merchants. Okay. Now, why are merchants at the bottom of the rung here? They're not poor in China. We just said there's tons of trade going on, right? They are very wealthy, right? Well, this is due to Confucian ideals of producing for the society, right? So since merchants don't necessarily produce goods, right, the Confucian society finds them kind of like almost siphoning resources, right? So they're not really well liked, right, in this society. Okay. And then, of course, we need to talk about the role of women in this society. It is so Confucianism mostly keeps a subordinate role for women, right? They do talk about like the respect given to women, but women in Confucianism are supposed to be deferential to the men in their lives, right? And one kind of clear example of this during this time period is, of course, foot binding, right? Foot binding was a way for women, especially aristocratic women, to kind of show their wealth because their feet being bound means they didn't work, which means that the family didn't need them to work. But also it was considered attractive by many men, and so it would be a way to attract potential husbands, right? Yes, this was an example of the patriarchal structure of Confucianism, and then eventually, especially Neo-Confucianism, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some technological developments here, cultural technological developments. One other key development during this time period is woodblock printing. Okay, so they've already developed paper in previous eras, but now we're going to see the development of woodblock printing, which allowed for massive amounts of a certain paper or certain book or certain pamphlet to be produced over and over again. Especially used, and the Song especially used it for farming techniques. Right, they would distribute writings on how to farm properly to different societies. Especially the areas of China where rice was produced, right? And so this leads to an increase in literacy, right? An increase in literacy, not too much, because the same people are kind of getting access to the books that were already literate. But what we also see, especially, is that this really benefits the Confucian scholars. Okay, the Confucian scholars, in fact, produce most of the literature in this era, right? They not only produced literature, they also made art, right? Like paintings and whatnot, and poetry, right? They were Renaissance men, right? Because the idea was that these scholars, when they went home, were to kind of sharpen their skills by engaging in writing or making art, right? Okay, so in religious things, right? We see Buddhism grow quite popular during this time period. Increase in popularity during the Song Dynasty. Okay, especially because, well, and not because this wasn't in this era per se, but a man by the name of Xuanzang traveled to India and brought back a lot of Buddhist texts with him. It actually became popular during the Tang Dynasty as well, right? And so we see he travels to India and comes back with a bunch of texts. He's also, of course, the subject of Journey to the West, the very famous piece of literature that we will get to when we need to get to. And so what we see is that there are 3 forms of Buddhism that make their way into East Asia and Southeast Asia. We have Theravada Buddhism. Oops. Theravada Buddhism. Okay. Which is a Buddhism centered on meditation and self-discipline, right? This is the more kind of classical version of Buddhism, In fact, this is known as the lesser vehicle because less people tend to follow this one. It is most popular in Southeast Asia. Okay, the one most popular in China and Korea is Mahayana Buddhism. So Mahayana Buddhism is a little more loose, right? It's about spiritual growth. It's about it's kind of worship of not necessarily Buddha, but also these things called bodhisattvas, which are people who reached enlightenment but stay on earth to help others find it. And then also kind of building monasteries and helping communities. Right. This is known as the greater vehicle because it is much more popular because it is easier to follow. Right. Theravada Buddhism is much more strict. Mahayana Buddhism is a lot more not strict. And again, we see this particularly in China and Korea. Okay, and then the last one, which is kind of a little bit syncretic in a way, Tibetan Buddhism. This is not the last one per se. We still have one more to talk about. Which focuses on chanting, is only particularly popular in Tibet. Okay, they all follow the same stuff that Buddhism has talked about beforehand: the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. But what we see also in China is Taoism will fuse with Buddhism. To form a new type of Chinese Buddhism, known as Chan Buddhism, also known as Zen Buddhism, which have become quite popular in China, right? And they were more focused on meditation, direct kind of experience of the religion rather than going to monasteries or formal learning based on reading the scriptures and stuff like that. This becomes very popular in China due to its fusion with Chinese beliefs and this kind of feeling of like it's a Chinese type of Buddhism rather than a Buddhism from a foreign land, right? We see the establishment of monasteries, especially in major cities. But the monasteries cause problems for the governments for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is not Chinese, right? Which makes a lot of Chinese people unhappy because, you know, China is the Middle Kingdom, right? And so everything is already superior in China. Why do we have this foreign religion building these monasteries here? But also, they were tax exempt, right? So any land that these monasteries owned was not going to get taxed, which became a major problem for the government, right? And so eventually we will see the Confucian scholars. There it is. We will see Confucian scholars help take over this land, right? The monasteries will eventually be given to the government or the land that they have, right? Okay. Last thing on this section is Neo-Confucianism, right? So let's see here. Yeah, we're just going to go skip straight into Neo-Confucianism here. Neo-Confucianism is going to be super important in not only China but also in our next couple societies we're going to talk about here. Okay, Neo-Confucianism is a blend of the excuse me, just been talking a lot today. It was syncretic. Can't forget that. Much like Chan Buddhism, right? It is the ethics of Confucianism. Ethics of Confucianism mixed with the spirituality of Buddhism and Taoism. Okay, and so this became, because of this kind of blend of all of these things that were already popular throughout most of East Asia, this sees massive popularity in all of East Asia, right, as well as places like Vietnam, right, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Okay, we'll talk more about Neo-Confucianism as we go forward, but definitely super, super important going forward, right? All right, I'm going to go a little bit out of order here with this section, just because I feel like I think there's a better way to organize this. The tributary states of China. Okay, so the tributary states, we are going to rank them in order from the most accepting of Chinese intervention, let's say Chinese culture, to the least accepting. And I figured from it's probably better to do it like this, right? Oh yeah, I can do that. Aha. Right. So the least accepting is going to be Vietnam. So we'll talk about them last. The middleist, which mostly accepted them, but also really took upon its own culture, is going to be Japan. And then the most accepting is Korea, which very gladly accepts a lot of aspects of Chinese culture without necessarily trying to do anything about it, right? Okay. What did it do that was very similar to China? Well, they centralized their government in kind of a reflection of Chinese governments. They adopted Confucianism and Buddhism, right, from China, right? They're doing all these from China, right? It's not like they're getting it from somewhere else. They're like, oh yeah, this looks good, let's do this, right? Confucianism was particularly popular amongst the elite. Buddhism particularly popular amongst the peasants. Okay. They adopted the writing system, which was abandoned because it didn't make any sense for their spoken language. But they even did that, right? The key difference, which I'm going to put in purple, the key difference here is that they had a powerful aristocracy. Right. So even though they adopted a centralized government with a with the civil service exam system, the large bureaucracy, and all that, right? There is no meritocracy, right? There is no merit-based system because the peasants are not allowed to necessarily gain status, and so because of that, there's no social mobility either. Okay. Second on our list is Japan. They already talked a lot about Japan in our last section. Not a lot, but a bit. They talked about, I'm not going to go into too much detail on Shotoku or the Heian period, but they do, during this time period, they get woodblock printing. Oops. Let's just start all that over. Woodblock printing. They also get Buddhism and Confucianism to go along with Shinto, the indigenous religion of Japan, right? But then they also talked about the tale of Genji, right, as kind of a way to show their differences, right? They created this kind of new literature that was about a Japanese society, right? They also used the Chinese imperial system, specifically the imperial court, right, where everybody lives at this court, which is what the Tale of Genji is actually about, right? It's a Japanese prince at court and his life at court, right? They had a feudal system, which was very different, right? And so what we see here is that you just make a tiny little kind of thing here. At the very top, excuse me. At the very top, we do have an emperor, and but we really focus on the daimyo at the top, right? The nobles, right? And then we have the, you know what? I'm gonna redo this whole pyramid over. Sorry about that. Let's go like that. Okay. So at the top we have the daimyo, right, who are basically in charge of Japan, right? The local lords, right? The lords of different regions, right? The emperor essentially has no power here, and the daimyo are also hire the samurai to fight for them. Okay, below that is going to be the peasants and the artisans, right, who are not particularly wealthy, and they have very little social mobility. And then at the bottom again, we have merchants because of Confucianism. Right, but feudalism specifically means no social mobility whatsoever. Right, you're not allowed to, you cannot be a peasant and make your way up to become a samurai. Right, and so we'll compare it more to European feudalism when we get to Europe, right? But for the most part, we see a lack of centralization in Japan, right? Post in this kind of era, right? Post 1200, because of the role of the daimyo. Okay. One other thing, though, to mention here is the Bushido Code. Which was the code of honor that the samurai followed, right? And then which included martial arts, loyalty to your daimyo, and stuff like that. And then, of course, seppuku and stuff as well, right? So yeah, we see a shogunate in China, or excuse me, in Japan. Right, we see a shogunate started by Minamoto literally right before we start this time period. Right, so we see a shogunate, which is not an emperor. Right, they are installed by a daimyo. Right, installed by the Minamoto clan. So basically, giving that clan in particular some power, but also creating a system where the clans had a lot of power, right? This is a military government. This is basically, the shogun's basically a general, right? Lastly, in Vietnam, very, very different from China, right? And I guess I should have put a lot of this feudalism stuff in purple, but that's okay. And Vietnam is very different from China. And what did they get from them? They did adapt the writing system. They did adapt architectural styles, right? They even did adopt a bureaucracy, a merit-based bureaucracy, right? However, Vietnam was way, way different from China, right? For example, one of those things is we have, women have greater independence in this society. Like, they run businesses and merchant stalls and all types of stuff, right? And they have a lot of power in this society. They had nuclear families in Vietnam, which means just kind of a father, a mother, and the children, and that's it, as opposed to the extended family we see in China. We see the villages kind of have independence from a national government, right? We also see the scholar officials of the merit-based bureaucracy, right? The scholars are loyal to local areas rather than to the national government, and would actually help lead rebellions, right? And because of this, the role of women being a lot stronger here, there's no foot binding or polygamy, right? Polygamy being a man taking several wives, and that's not allowed here. And in fact, they would fight China pretty consistently, right, for independence, right? And so that's going to do it for section 1.1. And I will be back in the next one with 1.2. I will see you then.